For 10 years, he was everywhere and nowhere, his voice echoing through grainy tapes, his image haunting the world's screens, his silence more dangerous than his words. From the deserts of Afghanistan to the quiet streets of Abbottabad, the pursuit became more than a manhunt. It became an obsession, a mirror reflecting the world's own fear and power. What drives a man to build an empire from belief, and what drives nations to dismantle their laws to find him, in a story that spans half a century. From the birth of a Saudi heir to the fall of the Twin Towers, from secret wars to the quiet hum of helicopters over Pakistan, every shadow hides a revelation. He was called the Ghost of Jeddah, the architect of modern terror, the man who redrew history without ever stepping onto a battlefield. But behind the legend was a fragile mind, obsessed, isolated and human, and behind his death lay the realization that ending him would not end what he created. This is not just the story of Osama bin Laden. It is the story of how the world became what it is now, watched, weaponized, and forever changed. In the spring of 1957, in Riyadh, the desert kingdom of Saudi Arabia was changing. Oil revenues had begun reshaping its skyline, and construction cranes shadowed minarets across the expanding city. Among the rising generation of the wealthy elite was the bin Laden family, a dynasty built by Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, a Yemeni immigrant who rose from humble origins to become the favored contractor of the Saudi royal court. His company built palaces, highways, and mosques, including the restoration of the holy sites in Mecca and Medina. Within this empire of dust and marble, his 17th son was born, Osama bin Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden. Osama's childhood unfolded in an environment defined by obedience and privilege. His father's vast wealth afforded him education, foreign tutors, and a sense of divine purpose tied to the kingdom's conservative Wahhabi faith. Yet the family's reach and his father's close association with the House of Saud also tied them to the machinery of the modernizing state. In 1967, Mohammed bin Laden died in a plane crash, leaving his fortune to dozens of heirs. The family business continued under Osama's half-brother, Salim bin Laden, maintaining deep ties to the royal establishment and Western companies. Through the 1970s, the young Osama matured in Jeddah, a port city where tradition met global commerce. He attended Al Thager Model School and later studied economics and management at King Abdulaziz University. The period coincided with a growing religious revival among Saudi youth. Sermons by radical clerics circulated on cassette tapes, denouncing materialism and Western influence. Osama, quiet and devout, absorbed these ideas. He memorized scripture, donated to charities, and withdrew from the social indulgence of his peers. Professors noticed his seriousness, his precision, and his increasing fascination with jihad, the concept of struggle in defense of Islam. He was not a battlefield commander. His function was organization, the gathering of Arabs into a single community under the banner of religious duty. Reports from the time describe him as calm, methodical, and reserved, moving quietly among fighters, recording expenditures, and distributing funds from donors in the Gulf. The network he nurtured was informal but disciplined. Volunteers from Egypt, Algeria, and the Gulf states passed through his camps, united by the belief that their fight in Afghanistan was the beginning of a global Islamic awakening. By 1984, bin Laden had established a close working relationship with Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian cleric and scholar who was instrumental in rallying Arab support for the Afghan jihad. Together, they founded the Maktab al-Khidmat, the Services Bureau, headquartered in Peshawar. Its purpose was administrative, registering foreign volunteers, arranging their travel, and directing them to training camps. Funding came from private donors, religious charities, and networks across Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. The Bureau also built hospitals and provided aid to refugees, further enhancing its legitimacy. As the Afghan war intensified, the Maktab became a magnet for thousands of militants, fighters trained in guerrilla tactics, demolition, and ambush operations. While most were focused on the Afghan front, a smaller cadre, those closest to bin Laden, began discussing the broader implications of their mission. In their view, the Afghan victory would not end the struggle, but would mark the start of a campaign to purify the Islamic world and challenge Western influence everywhere. The establishment of Al-Qaeda marked a turning point in modern militant history. It represented the professionalization of transnational jihad, an entity not bound to geography or nationality. In its earliest phase, the group consisted of only a few dozen men, including Ayman al-Zawahiri from Egypt's Islamic Jihad, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, and Mohammed Atef. They shared a common conviction: the next battles would target the presence of Western power in Muslim countries, beginning with the American military presence in the Middle East. Bin Laden's return to Saudi Arabia in 1989 was met with quiet skepticism from his family. The Afghan war was winding down, and the Soviet Union was preparing its final withdrawal. He was celebrated among certain clerical circles as a hero of the jihad. Yet his growing radicalism alarmed the royal authorities. He used his reputation to promote causes aligned with his ideology, funding religious projects and speaking against westernization. During this period, his personal life remained austere. He lived modestly despite access to wealth, maintaining a disciplined routine of prayer and study. Those who encountered him described a man of conviction, intense, serious, and increasingly consumed by a sense of destiny. He began cultivating networks within Saudi Arabia's conservative community, quietly recruiting like-minded individuals who saw the Afghan victory as validation of divine favor. In 1990, global politics shifted once more. Iraq invaded Kuwait, prompting the United States to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops to Saudi soil as part of Operation Desert Shield. For bin Laden, the arrival of non-Muslim soldiers in the land of the two holy mosques was intolerable. He proposed to the royal government that his own fighters, veterans of Afghanistan, could defend the kingdom instead. His offer was dismissed, and the presence of American forces became, in his mind, a moral betrayal. His disillusionment turned to open opposition. Through private meetings and publications, he criticized the royal family's alliance with the West. His rhetoric, Sabbath, once tolerated, now became dangerous. Under pressure from the authorities, he left Saudi Arabia in 1991 and relocated to Sudan, where an Islamist government, under Hassan al-Turabi, welcomed him. There he invested in construction, agriculture, and trade, while continuing to develop his militant network. By this point, the structure of Al-Qaeda was complete. It operated as a clandestine organization with defined leadership, training programs, and international connections. Fighters were dispatched to conflicts in Somalia, Bosnia, and Chechnya. Intelligence services began taking notice, and the name Al-Qaeda entered Western threat assessments for the first time. The transition from financier to leader was complete. Bin Laden had moved from logistics and charity to strategy and ideology. The man who had once built roads for the Mujahideen now built an organization that aimed to reshape the world through violence. The foundations of that transformation lay entirely in the years of the Afghan War. In the valleys of Khost and Paktia, among the smoke of Soviet shelling and the ruins of mud brick villages, bin Laden discovered his purpose. The war had taught him that asymmetric struggle could defeat great powers, that faith and persistence could erode military superiority, and that global Muslim unity under a single ideological command was possible. In 1988, as Soviet convoys withdrew through the Salang Pass and the Cold War neared its end, bin Laden's vision expanded beyond Afghanistan. The infrastructure he had built, supply lines, safe houses, and recruitment networks, became the skeleton of Al-Qaeda's future operations. From this structure would emerge the cells that later carried out attacks across continents. The prologue of his story closes not with an explosion, but with organization. The camps in Peshawar and the mountain hideouts in Jaji were more than relics of war. They were laboratories of ideology. They produced a generation of militants trained, connected, and convinced that divine will could be manifested through perpetual conflict. By the dawn of the 1990s, bin Laden had stepped beyond the boundaries of Saudi aristocracy and Afghan resistance. He had become stateless in purpose and identity, a man driven by the conviction that the modern world was an enemy to be dismantled. His journey from a wealthy youth in Jeddah to the founder of Al-Qaeda was complete. He had witnessed the fall of an empire, gained the loyalty of hardened fighters, and established a network that spanned continents. The seeds of every future act, from embassy bombings to the events of September 11, were already sown in those early years. In the quiet aftermath of the Afghan victory, when most fighters returned home, bin Laden did not. He remained in the borderlands, planning. The new war, the one that would define the next decades, had already begun in his mind. By 1988, the Soviet army was retreating from Afghanistan. Across the mountains, convoys of tanks and trucks snaked through narrow passes, battered and demoralized. For nearly a decade, the Mujahideen, a patchwork of Afghan factions, backed by foreign fighters, had bled the Red Army dry. Among the thousands of Arabs who had answered the call to jihad, one figure now stood apart, not for his combat record, but for the organization and infrastructure he had built: Osama bin Laden. He had spent years in the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, constructing roads, bunkers, and tunnels, channeling the donations of wealthy patrons into the logistics of war. He understood that the end of Soviet occupation would not mean peace. As other commanders divided territory and influence, he began preparing for what came next. A new phase of struggle, one that transcended national borders. The war had given him proof of concept. A global coalition of believers, poorly equipped but united by faith, had forced a superpower to retreat. To bin Laden, this was divine validation, evidence that committed men could overturn empires. The lesson became doctrine, The method of Afghanistan could be applied anywhere that Islam was threatened. Throughout 1988, small meetings took place in guest houses in Peshawar. They were discreet, limited to trusted associates. The discussions were administrative in form, but revolutionary in consequence. Bin Laden and his closest advisors began defining an organization that would outlive the Afghan conflict. Notes from those sessions, recovered years later, reveal the name he chose: Al-Qaeda al-Jihad, the base of holy war. It was not designed as a loose charity or a front for individual causes. It was conceived as a structured network, a base of operations, a registry of fighters, a command system that could dispatch personnel and resources to conflicts around the world. At its core would be an oath of allegiance to bin Laden himself, formalizing his leadership over a growing transnational movement. The decision marked a transition from the chaotic volunteerism of the 1980s jihad to the disciplined architecture of global terrorism that would emerge in the decades ahead. The founding members included Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian surgeon and veteran of the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, a former police officer from Egypt, and Mohammed VIII, the military strategist who would later design some of al-Qaeda's earliest attacks. These men were older, battle-tested, and ideological. They saw in bin Laden both money and legitimacy, a figure of piety and influence capable of uniting disparate Islamist factions under one banner. While other Arab volunteers planned to return home, bin Laden's group remained in Pakistan, setting in motion the machinery of recruitment, training, and financing. At the same time, the Services Bureau, Maktab al-Hidamat, which bin Laden had co-founded with Abdullah Azzam, was fracturing. Azzam envisioned continued support for Afghan reconstruction and future charitable work. Bin Laden envisioned something militarized and permanent. The divergence deepened until Azzam's assassination in 1989, in a car bombing in Peshawar, removed the last moderating influence around him. Responsibility for the killing was never conclusively established, but it cleared the path for bin Laden to take full control of the foreign fighter network. With the Soviet withdrawal, completed in February 1989, the Afghan battlefield emptied of its foreign benefactors. The United States and Saudi Arabia reduced funding, and Pakistan's ISI turned its attention to internal Afghan rivalries. Bin Laden's camps, however, remained active. Fighters continued to train under al-Qaeda's emerging structure, now repurposed for global missions. Bin Laden's worldview hardened during these years. He interpreted every event, from the collapse of the Soviet Union to the continued presence of Western influence in Muslim nations, through a theological lens. His correspondence and writings from this period emphasized two beliefs: that Muslim governments allied with the West were illegitimate, and that direct confrontation with those powers was the religious duty of all Muslims. By late 1989, his position in Pakistan had become politically sensitive. Intelligence agencies monitored his movements, and the Pakistani government, wary of jeopardizing its relationships with the United States and Saudi Arabia, encouraged him to leave. He returned to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where he was welcomed initially as a veteran of the jihad. In Jeddah, his public image was that of a devout, successful businessman. Privately, he began building support networks among conservative clerics and former fighters. His financial independence allowed him to fund publications and informal gatherings that criticized Western presence in the region. Within this environment, the ideology of al-Qaeda evolved further. The focus shifted from defending Muslim lands to actively attacking the centers of Western power. Events in 1990 would accelerate this transformation. On the 2nd of August, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, threatening Saudi Arabia's northern border. The Saudi monarchy, fearing a potential invasion, invited the United States and its allies to deploy troops for protection. Hundreds of thousands of Western soldiers soon arrived in the Arabian Peninsula. For bin Laden, this was an intolerable desecration. The land of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina, was now occupied, even temporarily, by non-Muslim forces. Bin Laden believed his own veterans could have defended the kingdom. He offered his men logistics and resources, presenting them as an alternative to American intervention. The royal government ignored him. To the state, he was a zealot without military standing. To him, their decision was apostasy. His frustration grew into open dissent. Through private networks, he distributed writings condemning the monarchy's dependence on Western powers. Intelligence agencies noted his increasing radicalization. The Ministry of Interior restricted his movements and surveilled his meetings. Within the family, his behavior created tension. The bin Laden group maintained its lucrative government contracts, but Osama's activities risked damaging the family's relationship with the royal court. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda's operational branches continued to develop outside Saudi Arabia. Fighters who had trained in Afghanistan were redeployed to other conflict zones: Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, and Bosnia. Bin Laden financed their travel and living expenses, using his wealth and a web of charities as cover. The organization had no permanent headquarters. Instead, it operated through a network of safe houses, mosques, and construction projects. In 1991, under increasing pressure from Saudi authorities, bin Laden accepted an offer from Sudan's Islamist government. The regime of Hassan al-Turabi was promoting itself as a haven for Islamic activists, offering land and business opportunities. Bin Laden relocated with his family to Khartoum. He invested heavily in construction, agriculture, and transport companies, embedding his operations within Sudan's economy. This relocation marked the internationalization of al-Qaeda. The Sudanese period would become critical for transforming the group from an ideological nucleus into an operational enterprise. From his new base, bin Laden maintained contact with associates across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, consolidating command through coded messages and trusted couriers. But the foundational years between 1988 and 1991 defined the group's DNA: a disciplined hierarchy, a doctrine of global jihad, and an organizational culture of secrecy. Recruitment materials emphasized sacrifice, obedience, and loyalty to the leadership. Training camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan continued to run under al-Qaeda oversight, producing small cadres skilled in explosives, communications, and intelligence gathering. Bin Laden's personal transformation paralleled the institutional one. In 1988, he was still the patron of a regional cause. By 1991, he had become the emir of a transnational organization with ideological authority. His speeches, distributed on cassette tapes, began to reach audiences far beyond the battlefield. Clerics and activists in Egypt, Algeria, and Saudi Arabia echoed his calls for resistance against Western influence and secular regimes. International intelligence agencies began registering his name. In 1991, U.S. analysts tracking extremist networks noted increasing coordination among Arab veterans of the Afghan War, many of whom operated under bin Laden's financial umbrella. The Central Intelligence Agency's early assessments described him as a financier rather than a commander, a categorization that would soon prove inadequate. The internal records of al-Qaeda, later seized in Afghanistan, show a level of organization rare among militant groups of the time. The group kept membership rosters, operational manuals, and a hierarchical command system. It established committees for finance, military operations, and media outreach. The system was designed to be resilient, capable of functioning, even if leadership were eliminated. While bin Laden lived quietly in Jeddah, and later in Khartoum, his organization prepared for confrontation. The veterans of Afghanistan were restless. Many found themselves marginalized or persecuted upon returning home. Al-Qaeda offered them belonging and purpose. It also provided logistical support, passports, transportation, and forged documents, enabling them to move undetected across borders. Between 1989 and 1991, several training manuals authored by al-Qaeda instructors circulated among Islamist movements. They covered fieldcraft, explosives, and intelligence tradecraft, blending military lessons learned in Afghanistan with religious justifications for violence. These documents formed the operational doctrine that would underpin future attacks. During this period, bin Laden also began cultivating alliances with local insurgent groups. He provided funds and training to Islamist movements in Yemen, Eritrea, and North Africa, strengthening al-Qaeda's reach. Many of these relationships were pragmatic, exchanges of expertise and equipment, but collectively, they formed the network that would later enable global operations. By 1991, the ideological architecture of al-Qaeda was complete. The enemy was no longer defined as a single occupying force, but as a global system led by the United States and sustained by local regimes. The organization's objectives were codified: to expel Western powers from Muslim lands, overthrow governments deemed apostate, and establish an Islamic State governed by strict interpretation of Sharia law. The transition from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the political capitals of the Middle East marked the shift from insurgency to terrorism. What had begun as a logistical support bureau for volunteers had become an underground vanguard, preparing for asymmetric warfare on a global scale. Bin Laden's years of construction and planning now served a darker purpose. The same skills that once built roads and fortifications were redirected toward creating an invisible infrastructure of violence. His command style emphasized decentralization, small, autonomous cells operating independently, but bound by ideology and allegiance. This model ensured that al-Qaeda could survive even under extreme pressure. When Osama bin Laden arrived in Sudan in 1992, he stepped into a country positioned at the crossroads of ideology and opportunity. The government of Omar al-Bashir, supported by Islamist ideologue Hassan al-Turabi, had turned Khartoum into a gathering place for Muslim activists from across the world. For bin Laden, it was a sanctuary, a place to regroup after his departure from Saudi Arabia, to rebuild networks, and to give his new organization physical ground from which to operate. Sudan in the early 1990s was isolated internationally, under sanctions and economic strain. But its leadership sought legitimacy among the global Islamist movement. Bin Laden's arrival brought investment and prestige. He purchased large tracts of land along the Nile, established farms in the Gezira region, opened a construction company named Al-Hijra, and invested in a road-building project linking Khartoum to Port Sudan. His wealth, inherited and expanded through these ventures, made him valuable to the regime. In exchange, Sudan offered him protection, freedom of movement, and a base to host operatives from around the world. The men who joined him there were veterans of the Afghan Jihad, Egyptians, Yemenis, Algerians, Libyans, and Saudis. They brought with them combat experience, technical knowledge, and a sense of mission. In Khartoum's quiet suburbs, houses doubled as training and logistics centers. The infrastructure of Al-Qaeda matured. Couriers, coded communications, and clandestine travel routes connecting Sudan to Pakistan, Yemen, and East Africa. During this period, bin Laden's life had two faces. Publicly, he was a businessman. His companies constructed roads, imported machinery, and traded agricultural products. They won contracts with the government and provided employment to hundreds. Privately, he oversaw the expansion of Al-Qaeda's reach. Financial accounts moved through legitimate fronts. Profits from farms and construction funded training and safe houses. The dual structure, public enterprise masking clandestine activity, would become a hallmark of Al-Qaeda's operational model. In 1992, regional conflicts provided new opportunities. In Yemen, tribal uprisings and political transitions opened routes for smuggling weapons and men. In Somalia, civil war created a vacuum that drew Islamist movements and foreign fighters. Bin Laden dispatched small teams to both regions, testing their capacity for external operations. Somalia became a proving ground. US troops had deployed there as part of a humanitarian mission under the United Nations, but their presence drew hostility. Al-Qaeda operatives established links with local militias, providing training in ambush tactics and explosives. Though their numbers were small, their influence was significant. The 1993 battle in Mogadishu, in which 18 US soldiers were killed, reinforced bin Laden's belief that American forces could be driven out through sustained insurgency. Intelligence gathered years later confirmed that Al-Qaeda personnel had participated indirectly in advising Somali fighters. At the same time, Al-Qaeda was extending its network into East Africa. Cells emerged in Kenya and Tanzania under the guise of business ventures and charities. These outposts monitored US and Western interests, established communication channels, and gathered reconnaissance. By 1993, the first logistical skeleton of what would later become the East African branch of Al-Qaeda was in place. Within Sudan, bin Laden lived with discipline and predictability. He kept a small security detail, prayed at local mosques, and moved without ostentation. His family, wives and children, lived nearby in separate compounds. Meetings with visitors were organized through intermediaries to maintain secrecy. Intelligence agencies in the region began to take notice. The Egyptian government, battling Islamist insurgency at home, accused him of harboring extremists responsible for attacks in Cairo and Luxor. Western diplomats in Khartoum reported sightings of foreign militants entering the country under his sponsorship. By 1993, Saudi authorities revoked his citizenship and froze his assets. His family business severed ties. The action severed his last institutional connection to his homeland, pushing him further into ideological isolation. Without nationality or state protection, he became a man defined entirely by his cause. International pressure on Sudan increased. The United States placed the country on its list of state sponsors of terrorism. Intelligence sharing between Western and Arab governments intensified, each seeking to map the emerging networks centered around bin Laden. Yet the structure of Al-Qaeda made it difficult to dismantle. It operated through overlapping layers of legitimacy: charity, business, and religion, each reinforcing the other. During these years, bin Laden formalized Al-Qaeda's internal bureaucracy. He appointed a consultative council, the Shura, to oversee strategic decisions. Committees were created for military affairs, finance, media, and religious guidance. Training manuals were compiled, covering everything from physical conditioning to encryption. The organization resembled a hybrid of corporation and clandestine army. Its members were expected to maintain secrecy, discipline, and obedience. While the group's operational capacity grew, its ideological doctrine deepened. Al-Qaeda's writings from this period show a shift from regional focus to global ambition. The struggle was now framed as a confrontation between Islam and the West, with the United States as the primary adversary. American military presence in Saudi Arabia, support for Israel, and interventions in Muslim-majority countries were cited as evidence of aggression. This framework provided both justification and recruitment appeal. In 1994, bin Laden began relocating parts of his network back to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the Taliban movement was emerging from Kandahar. The power vacuum left by the Soviet collapse had produced chaos. The Taliban's rise promised order aligned with conservative religious law. Bin Laden saw in them potential allies and future protectors. Couriers moved between Khartoum and Kandahar, re-establishing dormant training camps and supply lines. Al-Qaeda's influence was spreading in North Africa as well. Former members of Egypt's Islamic Jihad and Algeria's armed Islamic group maintained contact with Khartoum. The network provided funding and expertise for their insurgencies. These alliances gave Al-Qaeda reach across continents, while preserving deniability. As operations diversified, bin Laden continued to expand his business holdings in Sudan. His companies built a modern airport in Port Sudan and managed agricultural projects intended to feed local markets. The profits, however, were declining. Western sanctions and growing scrutiny reduced trade opportunities. Financial strain began to show, and his relationship with the Sudanese government grew complicated. Officials who once welcomed his investments now faced international isolation because of him. By 1995, Sudan had become the center of global Islamist networking. Conferences organized by Hassan al-Turabi brought together militants, scholars, and political figures from Iran, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Al-Qaeda operatives used these gatherings to forge partnerships. The country was now a crossroads of radical ideologies. Western intelligence agencies increased surveillance, mapping flight logs, money transfers, and communications. That same year, attacks linked to groups associated with Al-Qaeda struck targets in North Africa and the Middle East. Though bin Laden's direct involvement remained unproven, the pattern was clear. His ideological influence and logistical support were enabling acts of terrorism far beyond Sudan's borders. The perception of him shifted from financier to orchestrator. In August 1995, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak narrowly survived an assassination attempt in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The plot was traced to militants connected to Egypt's Islamic Jihad, many of whom had trained in Sudan. Under international pressure, Khartoum began distancing itself from bin Laden. Security services restricted his movements, and assets were quietly monitored. The government's balancing act, protecting him while avoiding confrontation with the West, was becoming untenable. Inside Al-Qaeda, preparations began for relocation. Afghanistan, still fractured by civil war, offered sanctuary. Taliban forces were gaining territory, and their leadership shared ideological alignment with bin Laden's interpretation of Islam. By early 1996, reconnaissance teams had traveled there to assess security conditions. The camps that had once trained fighters during the Soviet war were being rebuilt, this time for a new generation of recruits. During these final months in Sudan, bin Laden's focus narrowed. He issued instructions consolidating control over his dispersed network. Financial accounts were transferred through couriers rather than banks. Documents were moved out of Khartoum, stored in Pakistan. The organization had evolved into a decentralized but coordinated entity. Resilient, mobile, and ideologically unified. When Osama bin Laden's plane touched down in Jalalabad in May 1996, the Afghan landscape was once again a battlefield of shifting allegiances. The Soviet withdrawal had left the country fractured, and years of civil war had reduced entire provinces to ruins. The Taliban, a movement of former students and clerics from Kandahar, was advancing rapidly, enforcing a rigid interpretation of Islamic law, while promising order. Bin Laden's return to this environment was both strategic and symbolic. In Afghanistan, there were no extradition treaties, few central authorities, and a population accustomed to war. Here, he could rebuild freely. His arrival was quiet, but deliberate. Accompanied by family and trusted followers, he settled near Jalalabad before relocating to Kandahar, the Taliban stronghold. Local commanders recognized his wealth and influence. He offered funding for infrastructure, communications, and religious education, and in exchange received permission to re-establish training facilities. Within months, the camps that had once hosted Arab volunteers during the Soviet war were active again. They trained recruits in small unit tactics, explosives, and clandestine operations. Fighters from North Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia arrived through a network of couriers, each vetted and assigned to specialized instruction. The Taliban leadership, under Mullah Muhammad Omar, regarded bin Laden as both an asset and a guest. He provided financial assistance and international connections at a time when Afghanistan was isolated, but his ambitions extended far beyond the country's borders. For bin Laden, the return to Afghanistan marked the beginning of a new campaign, a global offensive against the United States and its allies. The safe haven offered by the Taliban gave him the freedom to convert ideology into operational planning. In August 1996, from the mountains of Tora Bora, he issued his first formal declaration of war against the United States. The document, distributed through Arab media, and later known as Declaration of War Against the Americans, occupying the land of the two holy places, accused the United States of desecrating Islamic soil and supporting regimes that oppressed Muslims. It was both a manifesto and a recruitment call. The tone was absolute, the objectives clear. Within months, volunteers across the Middle East began to reference his words as justification for violence. Inside Afghanistan, al-Qaeda's structure solidified further. The Shura Council operated from Kandahar, managing finances, communications, and training directives. Camps like Al-Faruq and Qaldan expanded their programs. Manuals were rewritten to emphasize attacks against Western targets. Bin Laden's personal security detail, led by his bodyguard Ibrahim Saeed Ahmed, enforced strict protocols. His movements were secret, his communications encoded through couriers and satellite phones. The organization functioned like a clandestine army, supported by an invisible logistics chain that stretched from Karachi to Khartoum. U.S. intelligence agencies were aware of his re-emergence. The CIA's Counter-Terrorist Center, CTC, placed him under close observation. Field reports described training camps housing hundreds of foreign militants and noted bin Laden's public rhetoric. Analysts assessed him as a financier with growing operational control. The State Department designated him a threat to regional stability, but without jurisdiction inside Afghanistan. Options for direct action were limited. Diplomatic communication with the Taliban produced no results. While al-Qaeda reorganized, the first signs of its expanded operational capability appeared abroad. In late 1996, cells in East Africa began surveying U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. The operatives, posing as businessmen and aid workers, photographed perimeters, measured traffic flow, and identified weak points. At the same time, in Yemen, a plot targeting U.S. forces was aborted after surveillance was detected. These activities formed part of a coordinated pattern. Reconnaissance missions designed to test security and gather intelligence for future attacks. By 1997, al-Qaeda's network had global reach. Financial pipelines extended through Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and charitable organizations in the Gulf. Communications were routed through satellite links and encrypted messages. Each regional cell operated autonomously but reported through couriers to the Shura. The system allowed flexibility and reduced exposure. Bin Laden's headquarters in Kandahar became both a sanctuary and a command hub. Visitors included militants, journalists, and religious scholars, each reinforcing his image as a leader of global jihad. That same year, U.S. authorities intensified their efforts to prosecute him. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, who had handled earlier terrorism cases, such as the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, began assembling a case linking bin Laden to attacks on American interests. Testimony from former associates described training operations and funding transfers. The legal groundwork for a future indictment was forming, even as al-Qaeda accelerated its preparations for a spectacular strike. In early 1998, bin Laden convened a meeting in Kandahar with leaders from allied groups, including Ayman al-Zawahiri of Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and representatives from groups in Pakistan and Bangladesh. From this meeting emerged a new coalition, the World Islamic Front for Jihad Against Jews and Crusaders. On 23 February 1998, the front issued a public fatwa, declaring that it was the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans and their allies, wherever possible. The statement transformed al-Qaeda's campaign from a regional movement into an explicitly global war. Within months, the results became visible. On 7 August 1998, 2 truck bombs detonated almost simultaneously outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The explosions destroyed buildings, killed 224 people, and injured more than 4. Most of the victims were local civilians. Investigators soon determined that both attacks bore the same operational signature: coordinated timing, similar explosive composition, and involvement of known al-Qaeda operatives. Intelligence traced phone records, bank transfers, and forged documents back to Afghanistan and Sudan. The U.S. response was immediate. Within days, President Clinton authorized cruise missile strikes against suspected al-Qaeda facilities in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum, believed to be producing chemical precursors. The strikes destroyed camps but failed to eliminate leadership. Bin Laden survived. His profile soared. In the aftermath, he moved deeper into Taliban protection, increasing the security around his compounds. The investigation into the embassy bombings became one of the largest international manhunts in history. FBI teams arrived in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam to collect forensic evidence. Thousands of fragments, vehicle parts, and human remains were catalogued. Witness interviews and recovered documents led to a network of conspirators across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Arrests in Kenya, Tanzania, and the United States exposed direct connections to al-Qaeda's leadership. In November 1998, a federal grand jury in New York returned an indictment titled United States of America vs. Osama bin Laden, et al. The document contained 238 counts, including conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals abroad, attacks on federal facilities, and providing material support to terrorism. It traced the origins of Al-Qaeda, its training infrastructure, and its financial channels. The indictment was the first comprehensive legal statement defining bin Laden's organization as a criminal enterprise. It identified him as the founder and leader of Al-Qaeda, responsible for planning and executing acts of terror against Americans worldwide. For prosecutors, the challenge was jurisdiction. The crimes occurred overseas, the suspects were dispersed across continents, and the principal target was in Afghanistan. Still, the indictment established a legal foundation for future action. Arrest warrants were issued. The FBI placed bin Laden on its 10 most wanted list. A $5 million reward was announced for information leading to his capture. Inside Afghanistan, these developments hardened bin Laden's resolve. The U.S. strikes, and the indictment reinforced his narrative that the West sought to destroy Islam. Recruitment surged. Fighters from Chechnya, Indonesia, and North Africa flocked to Al-Qaeda's camps, seeking combat experience. The organization expanded its training curriculum to include urban warfare, covert communication, and suicide tactics. Manuals emphasized patience, secrecy, and martyrdom. U.S. intelligence intensified collection efforts. Drones and satellites monitored compounds. Informants were cultivated inside Pakistan. Yet the terrain, coupled with Taliban protection, limited results. Diplomatic pressure on the Taliban to extradite bin Laden produced denials and evasions. Afghanistan had become both fortress and stage, the center of a movement that now operated openly. By late 1998, bin Laden's name was known worldwide. Media outlets circulated his image, a tall man in white robes, speaking calmly about war. To his followers, he was proof that defiance could wound a superpower. To intelligence agencies, he was a phantom, surrounded by loyalists, and shifting locations. The embassy bombings had demonstrated both capability and intent. The next attack was only a matter of time. The indictment represented a milestone in the evolution of counterterrorism. It translated acts of global violence into a legal framework, asserting that even a stateless actor could be held accountable under international law. But it also underscored a growing problem. Law enforcement mechanisms were insufficient against a network that operated beyond borders. As courts prepared cases in New York, Al-Qaeda was already planning operations that would render those proceedings symbolic. In Afghanistan, construction continued. The camps expanded, and new facilities appeared near Coast and Jalalabad. Laboratories tested explosives. Instructors trained recruits in aviation basics and security evasion. The Shura discussed targeting strategies, embassies, warships, and eventually, landmarks inside the United States. Bin Laden reviewed reports of global operations with methodical precision, approving budgets and personnel allocations. The organization's transition from insurgent group to structured global terrorist network was complete. The period between 1996 and 1998 transformed Al-Qaeda from an ideological alliance into an operational force, recognized by governments and courts alike. Its founder had moved from exile to infamy, from a financier in Sudan to the world's most wanted man. The U.S. indictment formalized his status, but it also exposed the limits of prosecution without presence. While papers were filed in federal courtrooms, he continued building armies in the Afghan desert. By the close of 1998, the groundwork for future conflict was set. Al-Qaeda possessed training camps, financing networks, and a global cadre of loyal militants. The United States possessed indictments, intelligence files, and growing frustration. Between these two realities lay the gap that would define the next decade. A chasm between law and war, between pursuit and protection, between the visible machinery of justice and the invisible architecture of terror that had taken root in Afghanistan. The smoke from the African embassy bombings had hardly cleared when Al-Qaeda began its next phase of planning. In the mountains of Afghanistan, within fortified compounds near Kandahar and Jalalabad, Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants reviewed reports from across the organization. The strikes on the embassies had proven capability, coordination, and global reach. The American retaliation that followed, cruise missiles exploding across desert camps, confirmed to them that confrontation with the United States was now irreversible. From late 1998 onward, the training infrastructure in Afghanistan expanded rapidly. Camps such as Al-Farouk, Qaldan, and Tarnak Farms processed recruits from North Africa, the Gulf, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Trainees studied small arms tactics, urban sabotage, and aviation theory. Some were chosen for specialized missions and separated into closed cells. The Shura Council in Kandahar oversaw financing and logistics, while bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri set ideological direction. Afghanistan under the Taliban became both sanctuary and factory, a self-contained ecosystem for global jihad. US intelligence agencies monitored but struggled to penetrate this network. Human sources were scarce. Satellite imagery limited by terrain. The Counter-Terrorist Center at the CIA warned repeatedly that bin Laden was planning additional attacks, but operational details remained elusive. Inside Afghanistan, secrecy was absolute. Recruits swore allegiance to the organization, surrendered passports, and lived under surveillance. Every movement, message, and assignment was tracked through couriers who traveled between Kandahar, Karachi, and Gulf capitals. In October 2000, Al-Qaeda struck again. In the Yemeni port of Aden, a small boat approached the USS Cole during refueling. 2 suicide attackers detonated explosives, tearing a massive hole in the destroyer's hull. 17 US sailors died. 39 were wounded. The blast was precise and devastating, the result of meticulous reconnaissance. Within hours, investigators identified links to operatives trained in Afghanistan. Bin Laden's fingerprints were unmistakable. The attack demonstrated Al-Qaeda's ability to target US military assets directly, reinforcing the perception among his followers that America could be hit anywhere. Despite accumulating evidence, global attention soon drifted. The United States filed additional charges, expanded intelligence operations, and pressed the Taliban to surrender bin Laden. The Taliban refused, insisting on proof and citing Afghan hospitality customs. Diplomatic channels froze. Within Washington, debates intensified between law enforcement, intelligence, and defense officials over how to respond to a network that operated without territory or nationality. Each agency collected fragments, yet no cohesive strategy emerged. Meanwhile, within Al-Qaeda, a new plan was taking shape. The idea originated with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a veteran operative who had previously proposed using commercial aircraft as weapons. In late 1998 or early 1999, he presented the concept to bin Laden in Kandahar. The plan called for coordinated hijackings of multiple airliners bound for the United States, each to be turned into a missile against iconic targets. Bin Laden approved, allocating funding and personnel. He named the operation Planes, later known as the September 11 plot. The group assigned to lead the operation was drawn from experienced members, fluent in English and capable of living unobtrusively in the West. Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehi, Ziad Jarrah, and Hani Hanjur became the core pilot team. They trained first in Afghanistan, learning the basics of flight simulation and reconnaissance, then moved through Pakistan to Germany and the United States for civilian flight instruction. Supporting operatives handled finances, logistics, and communication through intermediaries in Dubai and Karachi. From 1999 to 2001, Al-Qaeda's leadership monitored progress carefully. Each stage was reviewed through handwritten reports and personal meetings in Kandahar. Funding traveled in small transfers through remittance services and charities. Couriers memorized codes instead of carrying written instructions. To outsiders, the movements of these men appeared routine. Student visas, rental apartments, flying lessons, but within Al-Qaeda's hierarchy, every detail was recorded and approved. Intelligence agencies detected fragments of this activity, but failed to connect them. Arrests in Jordan and Singapore uncovered talk of aircraft and martyrdom operations. Communications intercepts hinted at planes and training, but without context, they were inconclusive. The FBI monitored domestic Islamist circles, yet had limited authority to act on foreign intelligence leads. Inside the CIA, analysts warned of an impending large-scale attack, but could not specify location or method. In the summer of 2000, bin Laden moved between Kandahar and Tora Bora, overseeing both training and security. The US airstrikes of 1998 had made him cautious. Bunkers were reinforced, routes changed frequently, and only trusted guards knew his position. Visitors from allied groups, including Jemaah Islamiyah in Southeast Asia and Chechen militants from the Caucasus, came to pledge allegiance. The global alliance of jihadists that he had envisioned in Sudan was now operational reality. The year 2001 opened with apparent calm. International attention centered on other crises: Middle East unrest, Balkan peacekeeping, and political transitions in Washington. Inside Al-Qaeda, preparations accelerated. Between January and June, the pilot team completed flight training in Florida and Arizona. Additional operatives entered the United States under various pretexts, forming support cells on both coasts. Each cell operated compartmentally, communicating through coded emails and public access computers. In June, intelligence intercepts recorded an unusual spike in chatter, referencing a major operation. Warnings reached US agencies, but lacked specificity. Analysts noted patterns resembling the prelude to the embassy bombings: sudden withdrawals of key figures from communication, increased courier traffic, and coded religious references to 0 hour. Still, no definitive evidence allowed preemptive action. Throughout July and August, US embassies worldwide raised alert levels. The FBI distributed bulletins concerning potential threats to American interests abroad. Inside Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda's leadership finalized logistics. The hijackers received final instructions, financial support, and travel documents. Bin Laden's advisors documented every expenditure and movement, ensuring accountability for what they viewed as a historic mission. By early September 2001, the operatives were in position. They had conducted domestic reconnaissance of airports and flight schedules, chosen transcontinental routes for maximum fuel loads, and rehearsed procedures aboard commercial flights. The plan was precise, synchronized to the minute, and dependent on surprise. Al-Qaeda's command center in Afghanistan awaited confirmation through coded signals sent via intermediary communications. At 8:46 a.m. on 11 September 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon. At 10:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 went down in Pennsylvania after passengers resisted the hijackers. Within 2 hours, the towers collapsed, the Pentagon burned, and nearly 3,000 people were dead. In Kandahar, news of the attacks reached bin Laden and his associates through satellite television. Al-Qaeda operatives worldwide went silent, destroying records and closing safe houses. The world's response was immediate and absolute. Governments declared states of emergency, airlines grounded fleets, and global financial markets halted. Within days, intelligence agencies traced the hijackers' identities and movements, linking them directly to training camps in Afghanistan and financial transfers connected to Al-Qaeda operatives. The Taliban refused U.S. demands to surrender bin Laden. Their denial triggered Operation Enduring Freedom, the invasion of Afghanistan. On 7 October 2001, American and coalition aircraft began bombing Taliban positions and Al-Qaeda infrastructure across the country. Within weeks, the regime collapsed under combined airstrikes and ground offensives. Kandahar fell in December. Kabul was retaken by Northern Alliance forces. Bin Laden and his inner circle fled into the mountains of Tora Bora, an area of caves and tunnels he had helped fortify decades earlier. There, hundreds of Al-Qaeda fighters made their last stand against U.S. and Afghan forces. Precision airstrikes and special operations targeted suspected positions, but the rugged terrain and winter conditions provided cover. Intelligence suggested that bin Laden was wounded yet alive. Despite encirclement, he escaped through mountain passes into Pakistan, assisted by local tribes and loyal guards. The exact route remains uncertain. By the end of 2001, Afghanistan's Taliban government had been dismantled, Al-Qaeda's camps destroyed, and its leadership dispersed. Yet bin Laden's survival ensured the continuation of the conflict. His image, once confined to propaganda videos, now dominated global media as the architect of the century's most catastrophic terrorist attack. In the United States, investigators compiled the evidence. Flight manifests, security footage, and recovered documents detailed every stage of the plot. Intelligence reports exposed how Al-Qaeda operatives had lived undetected, trained openly, and coordinated through legitimate financial systems. The September 11th Commission would later describe the operation as a failure of imagination, a phrase that encapsulated the inability to translate warnings into prevention. For Al-Qaeda, the attacks fulfilled bin Laden's long-stated goal of striking at the symbolic heart of Western power. For the world, they marked the beginning of an era defined by counterterrorism, surveillance, and war. The organization that had emerged in the caves of Afghanistan had transformed geopolitics on a scale unmatched by any non-state actor. The fires in New York and Washington reshaped everything that followed. The global manhunt, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the legal and military doctrines built around counterterrorism. In the months that came, bin Laden became less a fugitive than an idea, the embodiment of asymmetric warfare against a superpower. Yet behind that image remained a man moving through mountain passes, surrounded by bodyguards, his survival dependent on secrecy, tribal alliances, and the complexity of terrain he had once used to fight another empire. The attacks of September 11th closed one chapter of Al-Qaeda's evolution and opened another, a decade-long pursuit that would span continents, intelligence agencies, and administrations. From that morning onward, every operation, every lead, and every decision in global security would converge on a single objective: the capture or death of Osama bin Laden. When the dust settled over lower Manhattan, a new kind of war began, one without borders or uniforms, built on information, surveillance, and pursuit. The United States mobilized its intelligence and military apparatus with a single objective: to find Osama bin Laden. Within weeks of the September 11th attacks, American forces were inside Afghanistan, dismantling Taliban strongholds and seizing Al-Qaeda training camps that once teemed with recruits. The early months of 2002 were marked by relentless operations. The Northern Alliance swept through the north, while U.S. Special Forces and CIA paramilitary teams moved south and east, hunting remnants of al-Qaeda. Interrogations of captured fighters pointed repeatedly toward one region, the White Mountains near Tora Bora, a network of caves fortified by bin Laden himself years earlier. Intelligence suggested that he and his bodyguards were sheltering there, accompanied by Ayman al-Zawahiri and hundreds of militants. In December 2001, coalition aircraft pounded the area for days. Afghan militias under American coordination advanced through narrow valleys, guided by local informants. Bunker-busting munitions collapsed tunnels, and thermal sensors searched for heat signatures within the rock. For a time, it appeared that bin Laden was cornered. Yet he vanished once more. Later investigations concluded that he had escaped through mountain passes into Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, aided by loyal tribesmen, who guided him along goat tracks beyond the range of U.S. patrols. The opportunity to end the hunt in its first months was lost. With Afghanistan cities secured and the Taliban regime toppled, the war transformed into pursuit. Bin Laden's network dispersed into Pakistan, Iran, Yemen, and the Horn of Africa. Many senior figures were killed or captured in a series of raids, coordinated by the CIA and allied intelligence services. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, architect of the September 11th plot, was arrested in Rawalpindi in 2003. Ramzi bin al-Shib and Ovid Zubaydah fell earlier. Each interrogation yielded fragments, names of couriers, safe houses, and bank routes, but no confirmation of bin Laden's whereabouts. The hunt became a global enterprise. Inside the CIA, the counter-terrorist center expanded exponentially, combining analysts, linguists, and signals specialists. The National Security Agency intercepted electronic communications across continents, while drones, once experimental, became instruments of precision reconnaissance. Satellite imagery mapped border villages in Waziristan, and Kunar field agents cultivated tribal informants whose loyalties shifted with every payment or threat. Every rumor, every intercepted phrase mentioning the Sheikh was examined, catalogued, and cross-checked against hundreds of false leads. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda adapted. The destruction of its Afghan bases decentralized the movement. Affiliates emerged in Iraq, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. These groups swore allegiance to bin Laden but operated independently, launching attacks in Riyadh, Casablanca, Bali, Madrid, and London. Each event confirmed that his ideology had survived the loss of territory. Bin Laden, though unseen, remained the figurehead of a global insurgency. By 2004, intelligence reports placed him somewhere along the border, between Pakistan's Kunar and Chitral provinces. He was believed to travel with a small entourage, using couriers rather than electronic communication, sleeping in mountain villages and moving frequently to avoid detection. Efforts to trace him through financial channels failed. His network now relied entirely on cash and trusted intermediaries. American special operations teams conducted numerous raids based on tips, but each ended with empty compounds or false alarms. Inside Washington, political focus shifted. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 diverted resources and attention, drawing assets away from the primary target. Counterterrorism analysts warned that the manhunt was stagnating, but the machinery of war had broadened beyond a single individual. Bin Laden's continued absence became both a strategic failure and a psychological challenge, a constant reminder that the architect of September 11th remained alive. In Pakistan, President Pervez Musharraf faced pressure to act against militants within his borders. His intelligence service, the ISA, conducted raids across tribal regions, capturing or killing mid-level al-Qaeda figures. Yet bin Laden eluded them. Many within Pakistan's security apparatus sympathized with the Taliban, or viewed American presence as intrusion. The borderlands, rugged, lawless, and divided by tribal loyalties, offered ideal concealment. Throughout these years, bin Laden's communications were rare but calculated. Video and audio recordings, often released through Al Jazeera, appeared intermittently. In them, he referenced current events, proving he was alive. Analysts studied his appearance, the aging face, the background, the quality of the video to deduce location and time. None provided actionable clues. He appeared thinner, grayer, but composed, delivering messages that blended theology with strategy. Each release reignited the search, and each ended with speculation rather than certainty. By 2005, U.S. forces had established a semi-permanent presence in Afghanistan, but the insurgency was resurging. The Taliban regrouped, financed by the opium trade and sanctuary in Pakistan. Bin Laden's role shifted from direct command to symbolic leadership. Operational control passed increasingly to al-Zawahiri and regional commanders. Yet every pledge of loyalty from affiliates reaffirmed his authority. The hunt for his person thus carried not only tactical but moral weight. Capturing or killing him was seen as essential closure for the attacks that had changed the world. In 2006, fragments of progress emerged. Signals intelligence identified a courier known by the pseudonym Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti mentioned in interrogations. As part of bin Laden's inner circle, analysts began tracking his movements, building profiles from intercepted communications, surveillance footage, and human sources. But years passed before those fragments converged. Meanwhile, drone warfare evolved from reconnaissance to targeted strikes. Predator, and later Reaper, aircraft armed with Hellfire missiles, patrolled Pakistan's borderlands. Dozens of militants were killed, yet bin Laden remained beyond reach. Each strike carried the risk of civilian casualties and political backlash, straining relations with Islamabad. The United States expanded its covert networks inside Pakistan, operating without full disclosure to its government. The pursuit had become an intelligence war waged in shadows. In Washington, administrations changed, but the mission persisted. Files on bin Laden grew to fill entire rooms. Analysts examined family histories, medical records, even patterns of weather near suspected hideouts, to predict his movements. The search was both scientific and obsessive, driven by the need to close the narrative, begun on September 11th. By 2007, a new lead emerged. Surveillance of known couriers indicated regular travel between Waziristan and Pakistan's northern cities. The name Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti reappeared in multiple interrogations, consistently described as a trusted messenger and intermediary. Analysts concluded that locating him might reveal bin Laden himself. Over the next 2 years, the CIA methodically mapped the courier's network. In August 2010, a breakthrough arrived. Pakistani intelligence, unwittingly monitored by US operatives, recorded phone calls made by a man later confirmed as al-Kuwaiti. He was traced to a secure compound in Abbottabad, a garrison town less than 2 hours from Islamabad and home to the Pakistan Military Academy. Satellite imagery revealed an unusual structure: high walls topped with barbed wire, no telephone or internet connections, and residents who burned their trash rather than discarding it. The compound, built in 2005 at considerable cost, maintained strict privacy. Analysts noted a tall man pacing regularly within the courtyard, a figure they labeled the Pacer. Over the following months, the CIA conducted intensive surveillance. Drones orbited above Abbottabad, collecting imagery. Informants tracked the household's routines. Analysts reconstructed daily patterns: gates opening for a single vehicle, laundry hung discreetly, couriers arriving and departing. Every observation deepened the conviction that the residence sheltered someone extraordinary. By late 2010, CIA Director Leon Panetta briefed the White House that a high-value target, possibly bin Laden, was located there. Yet certainty remained elusive. No visual confirmation existed, no intercepted communication, or his voice. Debate within the administration centered on risk. An airstrike could destroy evidence. A ground operation could fail or spark a diplomatic crisis. The site's proximity to Pakistan's military academy raised questions of complicity or ignorance. Months of analysis produced a single estimate: the probability that bin Laden lived there ranged between 60 and 80%. Through the winter of 2008, 2009, the manhunt, that had spanned continents and decades, was converging on one walled compound. Every agency, every intelligence stream, from satellites to interrogations, was focused on that location. The CIA constructed a full-scale replica of the house at a secret training facility, rehearsing potential assault scenarios. Special Operations Command began contingency planning, aware that success or failure would shape the legacy of the entire war on terror. As the decade closed, Osama bin Laden remained hidden behind the walls of Abbottabad. He lived with his wives, children, and couriers, disconnected from the modern world he sought to destroy. He wrote letters to subordinates on USB drives, delivered by hand, offering guidance on operations he could no longer oversee directly. The once omnipresent figure had become a recluse, dependent on a single courier network. His physical world confined to a few rooms. Beyond those walls, the machinery of pursuit never stopped. Drones circled the skies. Analysts cross-checked data, and policymakers waited for certainty that never seemed absolute. The manhunt had consumed years, billions of dollars, and countless lives. But it was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. The world's most wanted man was not in a cave or wilderness. He was living quietly in a city under the shadow of a military academy, hiding in plain sight. The stage was set for the final act of a search that had defined an era. By early 2010, the manhunt had reached a strange stillness. After 9 years of pursuit, analysts no longer expected a single revelation. Only incremental clues sifted from static, chatter, and rumor. Then the courier reappeared. A phone call placed from Pakistan's north triggered a chain of analysis that broke the stagnation. Voice recognition confirmed the speaker as Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, long believed to be one of Osama bin Laden's most trusted messengers. Tracking software mapped the signal's path to the quiet city of Abbottabad, a settlement ringed by pine-covered hills and military installations. For the first time since Tora Bora, intelligence converged on one specific point on the map. Satellite passes captured a 3-story compound, surrounded by 18-foot concrete walls, topped with barbed wire. Unlike neighboring houses, it had no phone or internet connection, no visible mailbox, and an extra-high privacy wall shielding a balcony. On the 3rd floor, 2 security gates controlled access, and residents burned garbage inside the courtyard, instead of placing it outside for collection. Every feature of the site defied local custom. It was secrecy built into architecture. Analysts studied images in microscopic detail. They counted residents, mapped routines, and plotted movement patterns against the day's light cycle. 3 families lived within, 2 matching the Courier brothers, and 1 unidentified. From overhead surveillance, they observed a tall, thin man, walking in tight circles within the courtyard at regular hours, avoiding cameras. They called him the Pacer. The resemblance to bin Laden's stature and gait was unmistakable, but no direct visual confirmation existed. The information flowed to CIA Director Leon Panetta, who briefed the White House in March 2010. He presented the data cautiously, circumstantial, incomplete, yet compelling. President Barack Obama authorized an intensive surveillance program. For months, a network of informants and a small rented safe house in Abbottabad collected ground-level intelligence. Local agents photographed the compound from rooftops and streets. Thermal imagery measured heat signatures for electricity use. Drones began persistent orbits at high altitude, recording every entry and exit. Patterns emerged. A white Suzuki Jeep arrived periodically, with no license plates. Children played inside the courtyard, but never attended school. No telephone lines connected the residents. Correspondence moved through the couriers alone. The more analysts studied, the more the picture solidified. The compound housed someone who lived in deliberate isolation, protected by layers of operational security. Across Langley's operations floor, a quiet certainty began to form. By mid-2010, analysts briefed senior officials that the unidentified 3rd family could be bin Laden's. Still, probability estimates varied. Some calculated 40% confidence, others as high as 80%. The decision of what to do next became one of the most sensitive deliberations in modern intelligence history. An airstrike could destroy evidence or kill civilians. A joint operation with Pakistan risked alerting the target or compromising secrecy. A unilateral ground raid carried political consequences if it failed. To evaluate options, the CIA built a full-scale replica of the Abbottabad compound at a secret facility in North Carolina. There, Navy SEALs from Deva GRU, better known as SEAL Team 6, rehearsed possible entry routes and contingency plans. They studied walls, doors, and interior layouts derived from satellite imagery. Every movement, landing zones, breach sequences, room clearances, was drilled repeatedly until memorized. The operation was assigned a codename drawn from naval history, Neptune's Spear. At Langley, the small team of analysts leading the hunt worked under absolute secrecy. Few outside the circle knew of the compound's existence. The White House received periodic updates through secure channels, each briefing reducing uncertainty. By early 2011, the case was as complete as intelligence could make it, without physical confirmation. Panetta presented the assessment to the National Security Council. The House almost certainly sheltered Osama bin Laden. Inside the Situation Room, debates focused on risk and sovereignty. Abbottabad lay deep within Pakistan's interior, less than a mile from its premier military academy. Launching a raid without notification could trigger confrontation or diplomatic collapse. Sharing information could allow the target to vanish. The precedent of Tora Bora, where reliance on local forces had enabled bin Laden's escape, hung over every discussion. The consensus formed slowly but firmly. The United States would act alone. Throughout March and April 2011, weather reports, moon phases, and flight windows were calculated to minimize exposure. Stealth-modified Black Hawk helicopters were chosen for insertion, their radar cross-section reduced by composite materials and angular panels. A backup team with Chinook helicopters was staged across the border in Afghanistan. Communications channels were isolated. No message concerning the mission was transmitted over standard networks. During the final week of April, intelligence indicated that all residents remained present inside the compound. The courier vehicles had not moved for days. Conditions were ideal. On April 29, after months of analysis and rehearsal, the president authorized execution. Only a handful of officials knew the precise time or nature of the operation. In the early hours of May 1, 2011, in Washington, D.C., May 2 in Pakistan, the aircraft lifted from Jalalabad under moonless skies. Each carried SEALs outfitted in night vision gear and lightweight armor, accompanied by a translator and a tracking dog. Their flight path traced the mountainous border at treetop level to avoid radar. Across the CIA operations floor, real-time telemetry from drones displayed a ghostly outline of the compound. Voices murmured coordinates, altitude, and call sign updates. 40 minutes later, the helicopters crossed into Abbottabad's airspace. The city below slept, its streets empty. As the lead Black Hawk descended over the compound's main courtyard, a sudden aerodynamic vortex formed from heat, altitude, and high walls. The rotor wash destabilized lift. The aircraft settled hard inside the enclosure, its tail clipping a wall. The pilot contained the crash, allowing the team to exit uninjured. Outside the perimeter, the second helicopter landed successfully, deploying assault teams to block potential escape routes. Charges breached the outer gates. Within seconds, gunfire echoed across the quiet neighborhood. The SEALs advanced methodically through the guest house and into the main building. 2 of the Courier brothers were killed during resistance. A woman was wounded. Room by room, the operators cleared stairwells and hallways, moving upward toward the 3rd floor, where the pacer had been observed. At Langley, operators watched drone feeds in silence, unable to see interior progress. Minutes stretched into eternity, as radio transmissions reported cleared levels. Then, confirmation. Objective reached, target engaged. The tall man identified in reconnaissance lay dead in the upper bedroom, struck by rifle fire. Mission time. Inside the compound, under 40 minutes, teams secured hard drives, documents, and digital storage devices. They gathered women and children for transport, verified biometric data, and prepared demolition charges for the downed helicopter. At 1:10 a.m. local time, an explosion consumed the wreckage to prevent technology recovery. The surviving SEALs and recovered materials were loaded onto the backup Chinook for exfiltration. By 2 a.m., they crossed back into Afghanistan airspace. In Washington, confirmation arrived through encrypted channel. Geronimo AKE, enemy killed in action. Back at the compound, flames illuminated the courtyard as local residents awoke to confusion. Pakistani security units arrived within minutes, unaware of the mission's purpose. By dawn, images of burning debris circulated through Abbottabad, sparking speculation long before official acknowledgement. In Afghanistan, forensic identification began immediately. DNA samples compared against those of bin Laden's relatives confirmed the match with near absolute certainty. Within hours, the body was transported aboard the USS Carl Vinson in the North Arabian Sea. After Islamic rites conducted by U.S. personnel, it was buried at sea before sunrise on May 2. The decision eliminated the possibility of a shrine or grave site that could become a rallying point. In Washington, the small group who had tracked the lead for nearly a decade reviewed the chain of evidence one final time. The courier trail, the surveillance data, the assault telemetry, all aligned. The mission that had begun with fragments of intercepted communication years earlier had culminated in absolute closure. The CIA analysts who had first spotted the compound left their desks in silence, aware that their work had altered history. News reached the public late on the evening of May 1, 2011. Crowds gathered spontaneously outside the White House, Ground Zero, and military bases across the United States. For them, the operation represented justice for September 11. For the intelligence and military community, it was the end of the most complex pursuit in modern warfare. In Abbottabad, the aftermath unfolded under scrutiny. Pakistani authorities launched investigations into how the world's most wanted man had lived for years within a military cantonment unnoticed. Satellite footage and leaked photographs fueled speculation about complicity and failure. The Abbottabad Commission later concluded that systemic negligence, not conspiracy, had enabled his concealment. The compound itself was demolished in February 2012 to prevent it from becoming a monument. The material recovered from the site, computers, diaries, letters, and digital files, revealed a portrait of bin Laden's final years. He lived under strict routine, avoiding electronics, communicating through couriers, and managing an organization that had long outgrown his control. Documents showed frustration with affiliates, whose attacks caused Muslim civilian deaths, and attempts to direct operations despite isolation. He read Western news reports daily, and monitored the group's perception abroad. In the end, he had become prisoner of his own secrecy, surrounded by walls he had built to remain unseen. For the intelligence community, the success at Abbottabad was both triumph and reckoning. It validated years of persistence, but also exposed the limitations of global surveillance. That the most wanted man on Earth had hidden not in a cave, but inside a city under friendly eyes. The operation's secrecy, precision, and legality became subjects of global debate. Yet within its execution lay the culmination of a decade's pursuit defined by patience and calculation. The compound in Abbottabad stood briefly as the physical endpoint of a story that had begun decades earlier in the deserts of Afghanistan and Sudan. Its destruction months later erased the last visible trace leaving only photographs, fragments of concrete, and a legacy written across intelligence archives. Within those files, each detail, courier routes, drone footage, building schematics recorded how a single address had become the center of the world's attention. By the close of 2011, Al-Qaeda was fractured, its founder was gone, its sanctuary shattered, and its leadership dispersed. Yet the ideology persisted, transmitted through the same networks that once carried money and orders. The manhunt had ended. The era it had defined continued. At 11 p.m. Afghanistan time, on the night of May 1, 2011, the wind over Jalalabad airfield carried a low mechanical hum. Two modified Black Hawk helicopters sat on the tarmac, matte black and featureless, their lines softened by radar-absorbent panels. Inside each, men in desert fatigues waited in silence. They had rehearsed the mission for months inside mock compounds built to scale, memorizing distances and doorways until the structure existed in muscle memory. Now, under orders cleared only hours earlier, they prepared to fly into Pakistan on a mission whose existence would remain classified even after completion. The command structure was precise. Admiral William McRaven supervised overall coordination from Afghanistan. CIA Director Leon Panetta and a handful of officials monitored real-time telemetry from Langley. In Washington, the president and his national security team gathered in the White House Situation Room, watching a live video feed relayed through multiple encrypted links. Each observer saw only partial images, infrared silhouettes, static maps, fragments of motion captured by overhead drones. At 11:35 p.m., the first helicopter, call sign Chalk 1, lifted off, followed seconds later by Chalk 2. The pilots banked low across the Afghan border, following terrain contours to remain invisible to radar. The flight route threaded valleys and rivers, a 40-minute journey into the heart of Pakistan. Inside, the SEALs checked weapons, communications, and night vision optics. No radios broke the silence, except altitude and time calls from the cockpit. Outside, the darkness was total. Only the faint outline of the Hindu Kush broke the horizon. As they crossed into Pakistani airspace, ground controllers in Jalalabad and analysts at Langley tracked every second of movement. The mission's success depended on undetected entry and precision timing. Below them lay a sovereign state unaware that American aircraft were inbound. At 12:30 a.m. local time, the city of Abbottabad came into view, a grid of dim street lights and walled compounds. The pilots descended sharply, hugging treetops. The compound target appeared through night vision optics, a rectangular enclosure with 2 gates and a central 3-story house. Chalk 1 descended into the courtyard, while Chalk 2 hovered above the outer perimeter to deploy the blocking team. Then, unanticipated physics intervened. The narrow enclosure trapped the rotor wash, causing a vortex ring state, hot air recirculating through the blades. The helicopter lost lift. The pilot flared nose up, scraping a wall before settling hard inside the compound. Dust and debris engulfed the courtyard, but training took over. Doors opened, ropes dropped, and operators spilled into the yard uninjured. They established a defensive perimeter, while the crew destroyed flight data and prepared to scuttle the aircraft. Outside the walls, Chalk 2 set down safely. The perimeter team breached a side gate using explosive charges, establishing outer security positions. Nearby residents awoke to the dull concussions, echoing across the neighborhood. Dogs barked, lights flickered on, but confusion prevailed. No one understood what was happening. Inside, the assault team advanced toward the guest house. Through infrared goggles, they saw figures moving. The lead man fired. One of the courier brothers fell. Another engaged from a doorway and was shot. The team cleared rooms swiftly, identifying women and children and separating them for safety. From there, they crossed the courtyard toward the main building, the 3-story structure identified in months of surveillance. Breaching charges shattered the reinforced doors. On the ground floor, resistance was minimal. The first team secured the kitchen and living area, detaining occupants. The stairwell was narrow. The men climbed in single file, rifles raised, flashlights cutting through dust. On the second floor, a man appeared in the corridor, firing a weapon. He was struck instantly. Behind him lay one of the courier's wives, wounded but alive. The operators moved upward, clearing each room as they advanced. Time was measured in heartbeats, each decision calculated for angles and arcs of fire. At the top landing, they encountered a locked door. Thermal scans registered movement beyond it. 2 adult figures. The breacher placed a small charge, detonated, and the team entered. Inside the darkened room, a tall bearded man stood momentarily frozen. The operator in front identified him by silhouette, the face from decades of wanted posters, unchanged, except for age. 2 controlled bursts ended the confrontation. The man collapsed beside a bed strewn with household clutter. For a moment, silence returned. Then, the radio crackled with confirmation codes transmitted to command. Target neutralized. Across Langley and the White House, the words translated to a decade's closure. The image from the drone feed showed only static rooftops, but those watching knew the message's weight. The team secured the room, photographing the body and collecting biometric samples. Facial recognition confirmed a near-perfect match. Below, other operators continued clearing the compound, gathering hard drives, flash disks, notebooks, and personal items. Each object was bagged and labeled under dim red light. Women and children were moved to safe areas. Interpreters instructed them to remain still while search teams finished. At 1 a.m., demolition specialists rigged the downed helicopter with thermite charges. Moments later, an explosion tore through the courtyard, scattering fragments across neighboring roofs. The blast alerted the city, but by the time Pakistani air defenses reacted, the mission was almost complete. Exfiltration commenced immediately. Chalk 2 lifted first, carrying half the team and recovered materials. The backup Chinook, staged on a field east of Abbottabad, entered to collect the remaining operators. Within minutes, both aircraft climbed into the darkness, banking north toward the Afghan border. Mission duration inside the compound, approximately 38 minutes. In the operations center at Langley, applause broke through hours of silence. In Washington, the command team watched telemetry of the aircraft crossing back into friendly airspace. At 3:55 p.m. Eastern Time, confirmation reached the Situation Room. Geronimo EKI. The hunt that had begun with fragments of intercepted calls nearly 10 years earlier had ended with a precise timestamp. Meanwhile in Abbottabad, chaos unfolded. Residents poured into streets, filming smoke rising over the neighborhood. Local police cordoned the area as debris from the destroyed helicopter smoldered. Within hours, Pakistani military officers arrived, bewildered by the violation of airspace they had not detected. News spread across regional networks before official statements could be prepared. Back at Jalalabad, the helicopters landed to refuel. Inside one, the body lay wrapped in white cloth under refrigeration. Photographs were taken for verification, and DNA samples drawn. The aircraft then flew onward to the USS Carl Vinson stationed in the North Arabian Sea. At 1:10 a.m. Pakistan time, the president was informed. The identification was positive. The United States now possessed definitive proof that Osama bin Laden was dead. Hours later, a final decision determined his burial at sea. Religious rites were observed, washing of the body, shrouding, and prayer led by a naval officer fluent in Arabic. Weighted with metal, the body was lowered overboard. Before dawn on May 2, 2011, the ocean closed quietly above it. The material seized from the compound filled boxes, hard drives, flash disks, digital videos, handwritten notes, and thousands of pages of correspondence. Analysts would later call it the Abbottabad treasure, a complete archive of bin Laden's final decade. Within its contents lay records of communication with affiliates, lists of operatives, and reflections on strategy. They revealed a leader, isolated from the field yet determined to influence operations, editing statements and approving plots through handwritten instructions, delivered by couriers. In Pakistan, investigations began immediately. The government formed the Abbottabad Commission, tasked with determining how the world's most wanted man had lived undetected within a garrison city. Interviews with intelligence officers, residents, and officials painted a picture of bureaucratic paralysis and systemic failure. The commission concluded 2 years later that negligence and incompetence had enabled bin Laden's concealment. For U.S. forces, the operation set a new precedent. In modern warfare, unilateral action, executed with surgical precision, deep inside sovereign territory. It combined intelligence analysis, human sources, satellite surveillance, and elite training into a single 40-minute sequence. Every participant, from analyst to pilot, had operated within strict parameters designed to minimize error. The mission's success reshaped doctrines of counterterrorism and special operations worldwide. In Washington, the announcement came late on the evening of May 1 Eastern Time. Across cities and military bases, people filled streets, waving flags, and chanting as news anchors confirmed the death. For them, it was vindication. For policymakers, an inflection point, closing one chapter of a conflict that still stretched ahead. Inside the intelligence community, reaction was quieter. The professionals who had followed the courier trail knew the success rested on patience measured in years, not hours. They cataloged every fragment, the phone intercept that led to Al-Kuwaiti, the drone imagery, the pattern of life analysis, and archived them as case studies for future generations. In Abbottabad, daylight revealed the extent of destruction. The outer walls stood blackened, rooms collapsed from explosions and gunfire. Journalists crowded nearby rooftops, photographing the ruins. Within days, heavy machinery arrived to level the site. Debris was trucked away, under military guard, leaving an empty lot where the most secret house in the world had once stood. The raid ended more than a decade of pursuit that had spanned continents and administrations, from the deserts of Sudan to the mountains of Afghanistan, from embassy bombings to the devastation of September 11. The arc of bin Laden's life had closed in one walled courtyard, under a moonless sky. For those who had carried the mission's weight, there was no celebration. Only the stillness that follows execution of a long-delayed task. The aircraft returned to their hangars, the analysts to their terminals, the documents to classified vaults. The codename Neptune's Spear joined the annals of covert history. By morning in Pakistan, smoke had cleared, leaving silence over Abbottabad. Birds circled where rotor blades had churned the air hours earlier. The operation that began in secrecy ended the same way. Quiet, efficient, final. In that silence, the longest manhunt of the modern age was over. By dawn on May 2, 2011, the compound in Abbottabad was surrounded by confusion. Smoke from the demolished helicopter drifted across the neighborhood. While Pakistani police cordoned the streets, residents emerged cautiously, still disoriented from the concussions that had shaken them hours earlier. Within minutes, rumors spread: an explosion, a foreign raid, perhaps a drug bust. The truth would take only hours to surface, but its impact would echo across the world. In Washington, the confirmation reached government channels through encrypted relays. DNA tests, matched with relatives of bin Laden, confirmed the identity. The operation had achieved its objective with surgical precision. The message was transmitted across agencies. Target eliminated. No U.S. casualties. The small team of analysts, who had tracked the courier for years, gathered in silence, as data from Abbottabad uploaded into secure archives. Years of speculation had ended in a single line of code. At 11:35 p.m. Eastern Time, the president addressed the nation from the East Room of the White House. The words formalized what intelligence officers had already known. Osama bin Laden was dead. Across New York, Washington, and military bases worldwide, people flooded streets, waving flags and chanting. For them, it was closure for the devastation of September 11. Outside the White House gates, students climbed lampposts and sang national anthems under flashing lights. For U.S. intelligence and military leadership, the moment was less triumphant than reflective. The operation had succeeded, but it reopened questions about Pakistan's role, the durability of al-Qaeda, and the next phase of the war. Overnight, a manhunt that had defined a decade turned into a geopolitical test. In Islamabad, officials awoke to a storm of diplomatic pressure. The United States had violated Pakistani sovereignty without warning, flying deep into its airspace undetected. Military radar had failed to register the intrusion. Elite forces had operated minutes from a major academy without interference. The embarrassment was immense. The Pakistani government demanded explanations. The U.S. administration maintained that operational secrecy was essential. The exchange revealed the fragile alliance built over years of counterterrorism cooperation. The Pakistani army conducted its own investigation. Officers visited the site, photographed the wreckage, and interrogated local witnesses. Within days, the Abbottabad Commission was formed to determine how bin Laden had hidden in a garrison city for nearly 6 years. The inquiry extended over months, collecting testimony from intelligence officials, residents, and foreign experts. It concluded that there had been gross negligence and incompetence at multiple levels, but found no evidence of institutional complicity. Still, the damage to Pakistan's credibility was irreversible. Inside the United States, the raid reshaped counterterrorism doctrine. The success validated a decade of intelligence methods, pattern of life analysis, drone surveillance, and integration of human and technical sources. Training programs at Langley dissected the case step by step: the phone intercepts, the courier identification, the satellite imagery, and the decision-making process. Operation Neptune's Spear became a study in persistence. It showed that a trail gone cold for nearly 10 years could still yield results through patience and synthesis. In the days following the raid, the CIA cataloged materials recovered from the compound. The archive was vast: computers, flash drives, handwritten notes, and more than 100 personal documents. Analysts called it the Bin Laden Papers. Within them were letters to associates, operational instructions, and commentary on world events. The writings revealed a leader still attempting to direct strategy, issuing guidance on avoiding civilian deaths and maintaining unity among affiliates. He criticized groups that targeted Muslims and expressed concern about his public image. The documents also showed his isolation. He managed operations through couriers, unaware of the tactical realities on the ground. Reports to him described attacks long after they had occurred. He urged new operations against the United States, but his subordinates increasingly acted independently. Al-Qaeda had evolved beyond his control, a decentralized network of franchises, linked more by ideology than command. Among the seized materials were plans for small-scale attacks on American transportation and energy infrastructure, as well as musings on exploiting anniversaries of September 11. Many were conceptual rather than practical, evidence of a man still imagining global influence from confinement. The archive was transferred to Washington, analyzed and later partially declassified. It became a window into the final psychology of the most wanted man in modern history. In Afghanistan, the war continued. The Taliban, though displaced from power, persisted as an insurgent force. Al-Qaeda's senior leadership had been decimated, but surviving commanders relocated across the Pakistani frontier and into Yemen and North Africa. There, new groups, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQAIM, emerged, adopting bin Laden's ideology while operating autonomously. The struggle had outlived its founder. For the families of the victims of September 11, the announcement brought a sense of conclusion. Memorial services were held at Ground Zero and the Pentagon. Photographs of the Twin Towers filled news broadcasts, juxtaposed with the ruins of the Abbottabad compound. 10 years after the attacks, the story had circled back to its origin: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and a single figure whose capture had defined global policy. Inside Pakistan, crowds gathered outside the walled compound for days, taking photographs through holes in the fence. Vendors sold fragments of concrete as souvenirs. The government, seeking to quell attention, ordered the site sealed. Months later, bulldozers reduced it to rubble under military supervision. What had been the world's most secret address became an empty lot, surrounded by soldiers. The reaction across the Muslim world was divided. Some viewed the killing as justice, others as martyrdom. Militant groups vowed retaliation. Within weeks, Al-Qaeda released a statement confirming bin Laden's death and pledging continued struggle under Ayman al-Zawahiri. Intelligence agencies worldwide elevated alert levels. Embassies tightened security, anticipating reprisal that never materialized on the scale once feared. The operation's success also reignited ethical debates. Legal scholars argued over the use of force within sovereign nations, targeted killings, and due process. Human rights organizations questioned the decision to kill rather than capture. The US maintained that bin Laden resisted, and that operational imperatives left no alternative. For many, the debate was secondary to the outcome. The figure who had symbolized global terrorism was gone, and the machinery of intelligence had proven capable of absolute precision. In the months that followed, senior Al-Qaeda members were hunted across multiple continents. Drones struck compounds in Waziristan and Yemen. Commanders such as Atiyah, Abd al-Rahman, and Anwar al-Awlaki were killed in targeted operations. Each death disrupted communications further, isolating the network's remaining cells. Yet ideology, unlike organization, could not be destroyed by airstrikes. Propaganda videos and online forums continued to circulate, ensuring the persistence of bin Laden's message. Within the CIA, the team that had tracked the courier disbanded quietly. Some analysts moved to new assignments, others retired. Their files were sealed under classification, accessible only to future historians. The case had closed, but its echoes filled every operational manual produced afterward. The integration of human intelligence, digital surveillance, and special operations, perfected through the bin Laden hunt, became the model for subsequent missions across the globe. By 2012, the geopolitical landscape had shifted. The Arab Spring reshaped the Middle East, toppling regimes and fracturing alliances. In the vacuum, new extremist movements appeared, some invoking bin Laden's legacy, but diverging from his centralized vision. The US withdrew many of its forces from Iraq and reduced troop levels in Afghanistan, yet drone operations expanded. The war on terror no longer centered on one man. It had evolved into a continuous campaign against ideology itself. That same year, Pakistan completed demolition of the Abbottabad site. The ground where the compound once stood was leveled, fenced, and left vacant. Residents resumed their lives around it, the memory of the night fading into routine. Only foreign journalists and researchers returned, documenting coordinates where history had turned. The sea burial remained one of the most debated details, conducted within 24 hours, in accordance with Islamic practice. It left no physical trace. Conspiracy theories proliferated, some claiming deception, others denial. For the officials who had witnessed the process, the absence of a grave was deliberate, closure without monument. In Langley, a final report summarized the operation's lessons. It noted the importance of persistence, interagency cooperation, and the willingness to act unilaterally when intelligence justified risk. It also warned of complacency. The killing of bin Laden, it stated, was a significant victory, not an end. The document was filed under classified archives, its closing line underlining a principle that would define the next decade. The war on terror would continue, shaped now by absence rather than pursuit. Globally, the narrative of Osama bin Laden shifted from presence to legacy. His image receded from intelligence briefings into documentaries and textbooks. The man who had once occupied entire departments of analysis became a case study in evasion, ideology, and consequence. Yet his influence remained visible in conflicts that traced their lineage to Al-Qaeda's ideology, from the deserts of Mali to the streets of Damascus. For those who had participated in the operation, memory lingered quietly. The pilots who had flown into Abbottabad continued careers shadowed by secrecy. The sea burial remained one of the most debated details, conducted within 24 hours, in accordance with Islamic practice. It left no physical trace. Conspiracy theories proliferated, some claiming deception, others denial. For the officials who had witnessed the process, the absence of a grave was deliberate, closure without monument. In Langley, a final report summarized the operation's lessons. It noted the importance of persistence, interagency cooperation, and the willingness to act unilaterally when intelligence justified risk. It also warned of complacency. The killing of bin Laden, it stated, was a significant victory, not an end. The document was filed under classified archives. Its closing line, underlining a principle that would define the next decade. The war on terror would continue, shaped now by absence rather than pursuit. Globally, the narrative of Osama bin Laden shifted from presence to legacy. His image receded from intelligence briefings into documentaries and textbooks. The man who had once occupied entire departments of analysis became a case study in evasion, ideology, and consequence. Yet his influence remained visible in conflicts that traced their lineage to Al-Qaeda's ideology, from the deserts of Mali to the streets of Damascus. For those who had participated in the operation, memory lingered quietly. The pilots who had flown into Abbottabad continued careers shadowed by secrecy. When the smoke over Abbottabad cleared, and the compound was erased from the landscape, the question that lingered was not whether Al-Qaeda had been defeated, but what form it would take next. Osama bin Laden's death marked the end of a chapter, not the ideology that sustained it. Across continents, men who had once waited for directives from him now acted on their own interpretations of his vision. The decentralized organism he had engineered was mutating, splintering, adapting, and multiplying. Ayman al-Zawahiri, long the intellectual architect behind bin Laden's rhetoric, assumed leadership. His approach differed, methodical, didactic, less charismatic, but deeply ideological. From hidden locations in Pakistan, he issued statements reaffirming Al-Qaeda's mission to expel Western influence from Muslim lands and overthrow secular governments. Yet by 2013, the movement he inherited was fracturing under the pressures of regional conflicts and generational change. The Syrian civil war became the new magnet for global jihad. In its chaos emerged a group once aligned with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Initially operating under Zawahiri's sanction, it grew rapidly, absorbing fighters from around the world. Disagreements over authority and brutality escalated into a formal split. In 2014, the group declared itself the Islamic State, proclaiming a caliphate stretching across Iraq and Syria. Its black flags, videos, and territorial conquest eclipsed Al-Qaeda's influence almost overnight. For intelligence agencies, the shift marked a transformation in the architecture of terrorism. Where Al-Qaeda had emphasized strategic patience and global coordination, the Islamic State thrived on spectacle, territory, propaganda, and immediate violence. Online platforms amplified its message, drawing thousands of recruits from Europe, Asia, and Africa. The geography of jihad had changed from mountains and caves to cities and servers. Zawahiri's Al-Qaeda adapted by embedding itself within local insurgencies. In Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP became the most active branch, targeting Western interests and producing English-language propaganda. In North Africa, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQAM linked with Sahel-based militants, kidnapping foreigners, and attacking UN convoys. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab pledged allegiance, extending the network to East Africa. Each branch operated independently, but acknowledged Al-Qaeda's symbolic leadership. The death of bin Laden had shifted counterterrorism strategy as well. The United States expanded its use of drones, conducting precision strikes in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. The Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, refined its methodology into a continuous cycle of identification, tracking, and elimination. Targets were added to lists, missions executed within hours, and assessments compiled within days. The once extraordinary precision of Abbottabad became standardized procedure. At home, the U.S. intelligence community underwent transformation. The creation of the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, integrated information sharing across agencies, while the NSA's surveillance programs grew exponentially, collecting global communications, metadata. The lessons of September 11 had hardened into systems of permanent vigilance, yet public scrutiny intensified. Revelations in 2013 about mass data collection sparked global debate about privacy, power, and the price of security. Internationally, the consequences of 2 decades of counterterrorism shaped foreign policy. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq had destabilized regions, creating vacuums that extremist movements exploited. Refugee crises, sectarian divides, and economic collapse became incubators for radicalization. The ideology bin Laden had preached, resistance to Western domination, found new expression among disillusioned populations. Even without him, the narrative endured. In 2014, the Islamic State reached its zenith. Its forces captured Mosul, declared a caliphate, and imposed governance through brutality and media manipulation. Global recruits arrived in waves, believing they were joining the restoration of Islamic power. Al-Qaeda, now overshadowed, emphasized endurance over exhibition. Zawahiri's messages urged affiliates to focus on gradual insurgency rather than territorial rule. The ideological split defined the decade. Two competing visions of jihad, one pragmatic, one apocalyptic. The United States responded with air campaigns and coalition efforts to dismantle the Islamic State's territorial hold. By 2017, its caliphate had collapsed under relentless assault. Iraq fell, Mosul lay in ruins. Baghdadi's death in a US raid in 2019 echoed bin Laden's end 8 years earlier. Yet, as before, ideology proved resilient. Sleeper cells, online propaganda, and regional affiliates ensured that the conflict would persist in diffuse form. Throughout these years, Al-Qaeda quietly rebuilt its networks in Afghanistan and the Arabian Peninsula. It avoided high-profile attacks that might invite direct intervention, focusing instead on longevity. Documents recovered from later operations revealed that Zawahiri had instructed followers to embed within local communities, marrying into tribes and avoiding civilian casualties, a strategy designed to outlast Western attention spans. The counterterrorism landscape expanded accordingly. European intelligence agencies coordinated to monitor returning foreign fighters. Africa became the new frontier, with insurgencies in Mali, Niger, and Somalia operating under Al-Qaeda or Islamic State banners. The distinction between the two blurred as local grievances merged with global ideology. Terrorism had become less a centralized conspiracy and more a persistent condition of conflict zones. Meanwhile, the geopolitical environment shifted again. The Arab Spring, once heralded as democratic awakening, gave way to authoritarian resurgence and civil wars. In Libya, militias filled the vacuum left by Muammar Gaddafi's fall. In Syria, foreign powers intervened under competing agendas. Each crisis produced new militants and displaced millions. The same patterns that had once fed recruitment in Afghanistan repeated on a broader scale. For the United States, counterterrorism became an exercise in balance. The cost of 2 decades of warfare led to strategic recalibration. In 2014, combat operations in Afghanistan formally ended, replaced by advisory missions and drone patrols. Yet Al-Qaeda remained active in remote valleys, protected by the same geography that had sheltered it in the 1990s. The killing of bin Laden had removed a symbol, but not the structure. Within Pakistan, the aftershocks of the Abbottabad raid persisted. Relations with Washington oscillated between cooperation and hostility. Public anger over drone strikes and sovereignty violations fueled anti-American sentiment. At the same time, the Pakistani military intensified operations against domestic militants, suffering heavy casualties in the process. The borderlands remained volatile, an arena of overlapping loyalties and perpetual warfare. In 2016, the 28 classified pages of a congressional report on the September 11 attacks were partially declassified, reigniting debate over Saudi Arabia's role in financing extremism. The revelations underscored how the legacy of bin Laden's network continued to shape diplomacy 15 years after the attacks. Every investigation, every trial, every law enacted in the name of security traced its lineage back to the decisions made in the wake of his actions. Al-Qaeda's propaganda adapted to modern platforms. Where once cassette tapes and DVDs carried bin Laden's messages, encrypted chat groups, and social media now disseminated doctrine instantly. Recruits were radicalized, not in camps, but online. Governments countered with cyber surveillance, propaganda disruption, and digital tracking, an evolution of the same intelligence principles that had found bin Laden through data correlation. The battlefield had migrated to the digital realm. By 2020, the world was preoccupied with a new crisis, the global pandemic. Yet in the shadows, the same networks persisted. Al-Qaeda's branches in Yemen and Africa continued ambushes and kidnappings. ISIS, though territorially defeated, maintained cells in Iraq and Syria. The ideology of violent jihad had become a decentralized ecosystem, no longer dependent on charismatic leadership. The man killed in Abbottabad had become myth, both a cautionary tale and a rallying symbol. In Afghanistan, the cycle turned once more. The Taliban, after years of insurgency, regained momentum. Negotiations with the United States culminated in a withdrawal agreement signed in 2020. By August 2021, the Taliban retook Kabul, ending 2 decades of Western intervention. Intelligence assessments suggested that remnants of al-Qaeda remained intertwined with the Taliban hierarchy. Their fates inseparable since the alliance forged in the 1990s. History, in altered form, had come full circle. For historians and analysts, the death of Osama bin Laden marked neither victory nor defeat, but transition. His removal decapitated the organization's central command. Yet his narrative continued to justify new movements. Every insurgency, citing injustice or foreign occupation, carried fragments of his rhetoric. The structures built to fight him, drone fleets, surveillance networks, joint task forces, became permanent features of modern governance. 2 decades after the towers fell, the world he had shaped through destruction persisted in subtler ways. Security checkpoints at airports, counterterrorism budgets, encrypted databases tracking movements of people across continents. The shadow he cast lingered over global policy and public consciousness alike. By 2021, the compound in Abbottabad was a memory. An empty lot fenced with rusted wire, visited occasionally by journalists and locals who recalled the night when foreign helicopters shattered their sleep. The war that began there had scattered across the globe, its boundaries blurred. Bin Laden's legacy existed not in buildings or borders, but in the endless motion of surveillance, fear, and vigilance that his life had set in motion. In that sense, his death did not end the story, but transformed it. The conflict he began ceased to be a manhunt and became a condition, a permanent equilibrium between violence and control. The age of bin Laden had passed, yet its imprint remained visible in every checkpoint, every drone strike, every intelligence cable that began with the words, "In the aftermath of September 11, when American aircraft lifted the last soldiers from Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30, 2021, the circle of history closed." 2 decades earlier, the invasion of Afghanistan had begun as the opening move of a manhunt. It ended with the same movement in reverse, helicopters, leaving the same city under the same dust-filled sky. The war launched by Osama bin Laden's actions was officially over, yet its residue lingered everywhere, in military doctrine, foreign policy, and the unspoken calculations of national security. The Taliban's return to power marked a symbolic reversal. Many of the commanders who now ruled Kabul had once sheltered bin Laden in Kandahar. They entered the capital not as fugitives, but as victors. Western intelligence agencies assessed quickly that al-Qaeda remnants still existed within Afghanistan, subdued but present, interwoven through tribal and familial ties. For the United States, the withdrawal was not closure but a recalibration. Counterterrorism would continue from afar, through drones, satellites, and proxy partnerships, rather than permanent ground forces. In the months that followed, the world entered a new geopolitical era. Great power rivalry replaced counterterrorism as the dominant theme of strategy. Yet the architecture built to fight bin Laden remained intact. The over-the-horizon doctrine emerged, a system of constant surveillance and strike capability, projected from distant bases. In August 2022, an American drone hovering above Kabul fired a precision missile into a safe-house balcony, killing Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's longtime deputy. The operation, executed without troops on the ground, demonstrated how the legacy of the Abbottabad raid had evolved into permanent procedure. The weapon used was smaller, the strike instantaneous, the approval chain shorter, a continuation of the same pursuit executed with new tools. Across the world, terrorism had become a background constant, rather than a central crisis. Al-Qaeda's regional affiliates persisted in Africa, Yemen, and South Asia, operating as local insurgencies, rather than global conspiracies. The Islamic State, though territorially shattered, inspired franchises from the Sahel to Southeast Asia. These groups no longer required a single leader. Ideology functioned as infrastructure. The principles bin Laden had articulated, asymmetric war, transnational organization, the use of media as weapon, had been absorbed into the DNA of modern conflict. The international security apparatus that rose in answer to him also endured. Surveillance networks, biometric databases, and counter-financing regulations extended into every continent. Airports that once adjusted to temporary terror alerts now operated under permanent regimes of screening. Intelligence alliances, the Five Eyes, NATO cells, Gulf coordination centers, shared data in real time. A web of observation spun originally to find one man, and now impossible to dismantle. The age of perpetual monitoring had become normality. In the political sphere, bin Laden's ghost continued to shape decisions. Legislators still reference September 11, when expanding emergency powers or justifying foreign interventions. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, born from his actions, had cost trillions and redefined generations of veterans. Memorials across the United States carried names of the fallen not only from 2001, but from the campaigns that followed. Every anniversary revived the same sequence. Sirens at ground zero, moments of silence and renewed debate over lessons learned. Academics dissected his ideology, tracing how a Saudi-born engineer transformed guerrilla theology into global insurgency. Intelligence schools taught the bin Laden case as blueprint, how patience, information fusion, and pattern analysis could defeat even the most concealed adversary. Yet moral reckoning accompanied the technical study, the cost of endless war, the erosion of privacy, the normalization of assassination as policy. In that reckoning lay the true legacy of the man killed in Abbottabad. Within Afghanistan, the consequences were immediate. The Taliban sought legitimacy through diplomacy, promising to prevent their soil from hosting international terrorists. Western agencies doubted, but monitored. Reports suggested limited al-Qaeda presence, confined to remote provinces. The Afghan population, exhausted by 40 years of conflict, faced economic collapse rather than ideology as its central crisis. For them, the age of bin Laden was memory, a story that had begun before many were born and left their country in ruins. In Pakistan, debate over sovereignty and intelligence cooperation persisted. The shock of the 2011 raid had faded into institutional wariness. Drone strikes decreased, but never ceased entirely. Border regions remained lawless, echoing with the same uncertainty that had hidden bin Laden years before. The line between ally and adversary continued to blur, a geopolitical inheritance of the manhunt era. Globally, extremism evolved into digital form. Recruitment, propaganda, and funding migrated to encrypted channels. Cyber-terrorism joined conventional tactics. Ideology traveled faster than logistics. Governments responded with algorithms trained to detect radicalization patterns. Artificial intelligence performing tasks once done by informants. The struggle between secrecy and surveillance that had defined the bin Laden chase now replayed in cyberspace, invisible and constant. In the United States, cultural memory froze the moment of his death as national catharsis. Films, documentaries, and books reconstructed every phase of the pursuit, turning classified history into narrative. The image of the White House Situation Room, faces lit by a green monitor, became an emblem of decision under tension. Operation Neptune Spear entered collective mythology, symbolizing efficiency and justice achieved through silence. Yet beyond the dramatization, the institutions built to sustain that moment remained active, expanding quietly into new domains. By the mid-2020s, scholars began describing the period after his death as the long counter-revolution, an age when states reorganized themselves around the prevention of another September 11. The concept of normal security vanished. Emergency became structure. Border controls, digital monitoring, financial tracing, all stem from the architecture created to find bin Laden. Even as priorities shifted to pandemics, climate and competition with China and Russia, the intelligence footprint of the counter-terror era underpinned them all. In Africa, the echo of his doctrine persisted through proxy wars. Groups in Mali, Niger, and Mozambique invoked his name while pursuing local power. In the Philippines and Indonesia, remnants of Jamaah Islamiyah adapted his methods to regional grievances. None commanded the reach of al-Qaeda at its height, yet each represented continuity. The pattern was the same: vacuum, ideology, mobilization, and suppression. The cycle he had perfected outlived the man who invented it. Technology gave that cycle new form. Drones once used for surveillance became consumer objects. Encryption designed for privacy protected militants and citizens alike. Facial recognition and biometric tracking, originally developed to capture bin Laden's followers, now governed airports, protests, and city streets. The tools of the manhunt had migrated into ordinary governance. Every scan, every data point, every algorithm carried a faint imprint of Abbottabad. 2 decades after the towers fell, younger generations encountered bin Laden as history, rather than memory. They learned his name through archives and documentaries, not headlines. Yet their world bore his signature. A planet organized around unseen security layers, a politics framed by preemption, a media cycle born from instantaneous crisis. His death had not erased his influence. It had diffused it. In 2022, declassified sections of the Abbottabad papers revealed more of his writings. Analysts found reflections on global inequality, environmental collapse, and technology. A man imagining battles that would follow his own. The documents portrayed someone aware of his mortality, yet convinced that his cause would transcend him. In that conviction, history proved him partly correct. Ideology survived biology. The United States, meanwhile, continued to refine counter-terror operations. Remote bases replaced deployments. Artificial intelligence analyzed patterns of life from orbit. The enemy was no longer a single figure, but a perpetual possibility. The question that had guided 2 decades of policy, where is bin Laden, had evolved into a broader one. Where will the next one come from? In the Middle East, generational fatigue reshaped societies once consumed by extremism. Young populations turned toward economics, technology, and reform rather than jihad. Yet disillusionment remained fertile ground. Intelligence analysts noted that each collapse of hope risked creating another generation receptive to the same ideas that had carried bin Laden from Jeddah to Tora Bora. The war on terror had no endpoint, only phases of intensity and calm. The physical traces of his life diminished. The site of the World Trade Center became a memorial complex, visited by millions annually. The Pentagon's reconstructed wing displayed photographs of those lost. In Abbottabad, grass covered the empty lot where his compound once stood. The coordinates remained preserved in intelligence databases, but erased from local maps. Silence replaced spectacle. In July 2022, when the missile struck the balcony where Zawahiri stood, the event passed with subdued reaction. There were no crowds in the streets, no chance of victory, only a quiet recognition that another page had turned in a story without end. The technology had evolved, the players had changed, but the pursuit remained the same: precision, secrecy, and the unspoken inheritance of September 11. By the early 2020s, the war on terror had receded from headlines, yet persisted as infrastructure. Its language appeared in cyber defense, border policy, and artificial intelligence ethics. The ghost of bin Laden existed not in ideology alone, but in the systems designed to prevent his return. He had failed to establish a caliphate or unite the Muslim world, yet succeeded in reshaping the architecture of global order. The long shadow of his life extended beyond borders and generations. It hovered over airports, data centers, and courtrooms, reminding policymakers that absolute security was impossible, but eternal vigilance achievable. His death at Abbottabad closed the manhunt, but the world that emerged afterward continued to orbit the questions he forced humanity to confront: fear, faith, power, and control. In the end, the pursuit of one man redrew the map of modern history. 2 decades later, governments still lived inside the machinery built to find him. The war named for his destruction had transformed into a condition of existence. The long shadow remained, not a figure on a balcony or a voice in a cave, but a permanent shape cast across the 21st century. In the years that followed the final shot in Abbottabad, time began to smooth the jagged edges of memory. The photographs faded from news screens, the video feeds ceased, and the name that had once dominated every headline receded into the background of history. Yet the structures he set in motion, wars, doctrines, surveillance, and fear, remained woven into the fabric of the world he left behind. Osama bin Laden was gone, but the gravity of his life continued to pull events toward him. 2 decades earlier, he had emerged from the dust of Afghanistan, a wealthy engineer turned militant. Convinced that history could be reshaped through violence, he built an organization that transcended borders, harnessed ideology as infrastructure, and replaced armies with networks. When he declared war on the United States, few could imagine that his words would alter the 21st century. From that declaration flowed a chain of consequences that would remake nations, economies, and identities. After his death, analysts sought to define his impact. Some called him a failed revolutionary, others a catalyst of transformation. In objective terms, his goals had collapsed: no caliphate, no unified Muslim world, no victory against the West. Yet in destruction, he achieved influence. He forced the world's most powerful nations to reorganize their priorities around his existence. Trillions of dollars were spent, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, entire governments restructured, all in response to a man hidden behind concrete walls and silence. The shape of that silence became the defining image of the modern era. Governments learned that threats could emerge from shadows, not armies. Intelligence replaced armies as the first line of defense. Satellites and sensors replaced borders. The modern state evolved into an organism built on information, sustained by fear of absence. This was bin Laden's unintended legacy. Not victory, but transformation. Across the Middle East, the wars ignited by his actions reshaped societies. Iraq fractured under invasion and insurgency, spawning movements that drew from his ideology, even as they diverged from his control. Afghanistan, his original theater, oscillated between occupation and withdrawal, until the same flag that once sheltered him rose again over Kabul. Syria burned, Yemen starved, and Libya collapsed. Each conflict carried traces of his ghost, embedded in the logic of intervention and retaliation. For the United States, the decade after his death was one of exhaustion and reflection. The endless conflict, once framed as righteous retaliation, became an inheritance passed between administrations. The war on terror evolved into a network of smaller wars, unseen, continuous, fought by drones and analysts, rather than soldiers in trenches. The public grew distant from the battlefield, yet the machinery operated, perpetually, self-sustaining. The question once whispered through every corridor of Langley, "Where is bin Laden?" had been answered, but new questions had taken its place. What have we become to find him? In Europe, Asia, and Africa, governments adapted similar measures. Surveillance laws expanded, borders hardened, and the notion of privacy changed. Every airport, embassy, and subway carried procedures derived from a single morning in September 2001. Children born after that day grew up in a world calibrated to prevent its repetition. The memory of the towers became both warning and justification, ensuring that bin Laden's shadow extended into generations that never saw him alive. Historians examining the archive recovered from Abeda described the paradox of his final years. The man who had sought global upheaval spent his last decade imprisoned by his own security measures. He wrote about strategy while confined to a room, watched the world he set ablaze through second-hand reports, and sought meaning in isolation. His vision of perpetual jihad had turned inward. His organization had become mythology. The walls that protected him also defined his irrelevance. And yet, in the absence of his voice, the conflicts he inspired continued to evolve. Groups once loyal to him splintered into new forms. Some pursued regional insurgencies. Others adopted his rhetoric to justify entirely different agendas. The name Al-Qaeda became less a command structure than a brand, an adaptable symbol for defiance and power. In this diffusion lay his strange success. Ideology detached from the man, capable of survival even when its author was erased. For those who hunted him, the end came with conflicting emotions. The intelligence officers who traced the courier remembered relief, not triumph. The soldiers who entered the compound remembered precision, not vengeance. The political leaders who authorized the mission understood its necessity, but not its peace. Killing bin Laden ended an operation, not a war. The silence that followed felt less like victory than completion. A box checked, a narrative closed. In Abbottabad, the ground where his compound once stood became a patch of empty earth. Grass covered the remains, and the streets returned to ordinary life. Children played nearby, unaware that history had turned there. Tourists occasionally visited, photographing the empty lot through rusted fences, finding only weeds and foundations. The place that once symbolized absolute secrecy had become anonymous again. A fitting memorial for a man whose power was built on invisibility. In the seas where his body was buried, no marker exists. The waves erased the coordinates, leaving nothing but speculation and myth. Fishermen sail unknowingly over the spot, indifferent to its significance. It is as if the ocean absorbed the last trace of the century's most wanted man, and returned only stillness. The broader reckoning arrived slowly. Governments that had expanded in the name of security faced questions of scale and cost. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had consumed economies and reshaped politics. Veterans returned to divided nations unsure of what their sacrifices achieved. The justification, justice for September 11, had been fulfilled, yet the machinery built for that purpose persisted. Surveillance systems, detention policies, and secret programs became normalized. The extraordinary had become permanent. In academia and journalism, bin Laden's story became a case study. Analysts traced his trajectory from privileged upbringing to ideological radicalization. They examined the cultural, religious, and political conditions that allowed his worldview to resonate. Some concluded that his rise reflected deeper fractures within globalization itself, a backlash against inequality and identity loss. Others argued that he exploited grievances rather than representing them. Whatever the interpretation, consensus formed on one point: he altered history, not through power, but through perception. The images of collapsing towers, burning embassies, and smoking battlefields formed the visual lexicon of the early 21st century. They shaped how nations defined threat and how citizens understood safety. In those images, bin Laden achieved his lasting influence, not the caliphate he envisioned, but a world perpetually aware of vulnerability. By the third decade after his death, his name remained an incantation of warning rather than reverence. For most, it symbolized the moment innocence ended, the point where optimism about globalization gave way to the age of fear. For others, it marked the beginning of their careers, their doctrines, their technologies. His life had become the hinge upon which the modern era turned. In museums and memorials, exhibits chronicled the progression from September 11 to Abbottabad. Photographs of Ground Zero stood beside images of the compound's ruins. Timelines connected the dots between cause and consequence, from hijacked planes to drones in the sky. Visitors walked through them in silence, aware that every step in the exhibition mirrored one taken by governments in the real world. For intelligence agencies, the lessons hardened into methodology, patience, integration, precision. For philosophers, the story raised questions about morality and inevitability. Could history have unfolded differently? Could a single decision, during the Soviet War, during Sudan's exile, during Tora Bora, have changed the trajectory? The answers remain speculative, the consequences irreversible. In the end, Osama bin Laden's story closed not with a roar, but with endurance. The fire he ignited continued to burn in smaller, scattered forms, in the rhetoric of militants, in the vigilance of governments, in the algorithms of surveillance. His death resolved nothing. It merely froze the conflict into permanence. The world that emerged after him learned to function with intention, balancing freedom and fear, transparency and secrecy, war and peace. That equilibrium, restless, fragile, self-sustaining, was his final monument. There are no statues, no graves, no banners bearing his likeness, only systems, structures, and silences that trace their origin to his life. In those silences, the 21st century found its reflection. A civilization remade by the pursuit of one man. The world did not end with his death. It continued, reordered, recalibrated, permanently altered. The echo of his choices vibrated through every airport checkpoint, every intelligence briefing, every satellite orbiting the Earth. His name became less a person than a principle. The idea that one act can redraw the boundaries of power forever. Some legacies are built on creation, others on consequence. His was the latter. When history records his story, it will measure it not by what he achieved, but by what humanity became in answering him. And in that measure lies the true meaning of the age he defined, the age of vigilance, shadow, and silence.